It's truly been it's been a couple weeks since we've last been here, but this is another rendition of our Let's Talk series where I just kind of rant without any like specific topic or, consideration for actual logical structure. I mean, I'll try to be logical, of course, but let's talk about the last few weeks of politics, and then I'm gonna get into some the random theories or ideas that I've come up with that I think are relevant to just society as a whole and some ideas that I want to get into. So the first thing I thought was really interesting. The nature of politics is really quite, fascinating in this is the current situation with the I'll say immigration, but what I really mean is ICE, and because it has layers. Each kind of interest group has different ways of prioritizing the aspects. For example, a lot of I guess right wingers will focus more on the macro scale, right, of immigration and not only illegal immigration, right, but legal immigration, visas specifically. And then there's also the other side, which when they're looking at this whole, I want to say Trumpian immigration crisis, it's a lot about the actions domestically, because there isn't really that much of an argument that is, compelling enough to make public discourse that has to do with why immigration is important, other than the, immigration causes economic boom kind of thing. And I wanted to bring that up because it's quite interesting how media perception, especially, rears its head in this particular case. Because think about it, right? Like we hear about like police brutality stats, and I don't have them pulled up right now, like the FBI ones, but that happened, police brutality or police related officer involved related shootings, right? That happens more than we think, but also less than we think at the same time. So it does happen, but not like most times, right? Not only for black or white or Hispanic, right? Like it's not anything specific. That's due to police do happen, right? And it's gonna happen not daily, but often enough where it becomes a problem and is a nationally talked about issue. And that affects a lot more people than ICE has so far in Minneapolis. It's the two very unfortunate deaths. I have my own opinions about them, which I may or may not get into in a bit, but the it's much more easy to attribute something negative to the federal government, especially the Trump administration, when something is done still by the government, even if it is, under the same sentiment as the administration, when it's done through ICE, which is a federal agency, right? Federal task force, something, in the middle, right? And I don't want to call it overblown, but I think a lot of the focus is kind of grasping at straws, and it's already kind of gone away a little bit. The focus has shifted to a certain extent. But it really is interesting to see how the perceptions of what is considered the morally correct thing at a certain the current thing kind of idea, it does shift like quite dramatically across time. Because in the wake of one thing coming up, a lot of things or other things are lost, which unless you are having proper discourse about something with actual, consistent minutes, I guess, to any meeting, you're not going to be able to actually remember and make sure you're able to talk about the right and relevant things at every single time which is necessary. For example, only 4 years ago, police brutality was the biggest issue. Obviously, I'm sure there's been improvements in training and such. However, we have no reason to believe that this is still not an issue because, of course, people still die to officers, whether or not it's because they pulled a gun or unfortunate circumstances or racial circumstances, right? And that's like not it's not like that's not an issue, but when it becomes so easy to actually like ostracize one thing as and overblow it due to the perceived insanity of it, I think that's just interesting how that becomes a thing. And on the other side, I feel like this whole immigration thing has been overblown because if you are a supporter of, at least if you were talking in the context, excuse me, of what Trumpian immigration policy is supposed to be and his entire administration as a whole, he is more or less fulfilling his obligations and what people voted him in for. Now, the consequences of that are the things that we are experiencing and the negative blowback, right? Which is going to be two deaths and killings and, dozens of other minor injuries and battery cases. However, these consequences do not permit someone to completely ignore the success or lack thereof of the current administration's immigration policy because it is wildly successful, both through, of course, increased funding for Homeland Security and also general fear, I think, of, people trying to come into the country, of what may happen to them once they are here. The border crossings have dropped dramatically, at least as of the last few, at least within the first few months to a year of the presidency. And I think that's not to be overlooked, because when you talk about deportations, you have that multiple definitions thing, right? If you want to talk about like Obama era, deportations could include people turned away at the border, and it could also mean, of course, as he was famously known as, the deporter in chief, people expelled from the country itself. Both of which have been done at this point in the administration. However, I think the more powerful statement is that yes, we have actually seen less people trying to attempt to border cross, which I think was the original goal in the first place. Now, economically, right, it makes no sense to try to actually like spend this much money, this much effort, especially when there's this much resistance on trying to get, trying to deport people who you may or may not be able to find consistently or relatively quickly. And I think to that extent, the protests have finally worked, and that the ICE is, or a majority of the federal agents are actually leaving Minnesota or Minneapolis at the very least. And I think that's a valuable thing. I feel like we should just be focusing on the incoming and not the, people who are already here. However, again, criminals and the criminals are such and that, and people agree that the criminals should be expelled, and I feel like that's a common sentiment enough across America. But regardless, I think this whole situation with how overblown I think Minneapolis was, um, I don't know if overblown is the right word, but I think there's lacked serious context in comparison to other things that happened, especially in that city. If you look back to like BLM, this is much more minor and mute than what happened 4 years ago, for probably less, honestly. And I think that's because it's very much harder to relate to the idea of opposing people. Like again, you can hate the practices, you can hate the consequences of the actions, and you can hate the methods of practice. However, ideologically, it's very difficult to actually go against the actual concept that they are trying to reach. Unlike with BLM, where the concept that they were at least preaching wasn't quite immigration officials bad. It was like, or it wasn't even police bad, which I think the more radical wings took. It was more that this whole idea of racial equity, I guess, or screw that. No, it's like civil rights type of thing, and that's just like a small difference. The next thing I want to talk about is what I was thinking about recently. With we hear a lot more, especially because stupid Turning Point USA halftime show, right? There is a sort of snowflake radical right type, which is also happens to intermesh with Christian fundamentalists. And looking back a few years, decades, of course, which I was not alive for, the rise and fall and also the evolution of the Christian fundamentalist movement, especially when it comes to family values, is really quite fascinating, because we have to really look at whether or not their ideas even work in a modern setting, and whether or not that's even a possible idea. So like if we're thinking family values today, it might mean differently than what obviously meant 100 years ago, and that's for obvious reasons, right? We've come a long way in terms of not only the expectation of education children to work, but also the maturity of children tends to be later at this point because of college and arrested development, but also the fact that women have rights now, which is pretty nice, and that has resulted, whether or not that's a good. So this is a thing that really like side tangent that I really get griped. It's a really big gripe of mine, is that saying that there are consequences to the women's right movement is not a necessarily a going against the idea of women's rights. It's simply an observation. Regardless, both things have resulted in a difference in family dynamics, right? For example, one of the biggest things I wanted to cite, and I don't have the graph up with me right now because it's not a normal video, but the amount of families, presumably, right, of where both parents they have income, and both, parents try to actually work a job for full time, that has increased, like an exponential amount over the last 100 years for obvious reasons, like I said before. And then the problem with that is, one thing is, I feel like there has to be something happening with children and psychology, because again, you are meant to be with your parents from an early age going on, and being missing at least one of those for at least like 9 hours a day, you're stuck in a daycare or with like a nanny who you may or may not get attached to, or whatever, going through different people. I feel like en masse there has to be some sort of unknown psychological effect, which has led us to be more susceptible to X, Y, and Z. Regardless, the point I'm trying to get to is that the idea of family has shifted a lot, in that America as a melange, or in as French for like a mixture of different races and different people, results in the idea of there's so much to go through on this. So that's combined with rising individualism, which is a natural extension of what happens when you have an industrial system where people are encouraged to work and earn for themselves, and they're subsisting by themselves essentially. Even if they may provide for a family, the work itself is done by themselves. Anyways, as that has increased, so as both working has increased in both sexes, and the work itself has turned people more individual, our perceptions of family have changed. And that is also due to, as I was trying to say earlier, this is a lot, right? The intersection between different, not necessarily racial, but different ethno-national groups, for example, like Irish German. The more that has gone on, the more there has been, mixing of communities. It's been more easy to see how there's a difference between big and small family, which is the point I'm going to try to get to now, which is a novel idea of which may or may not exist out there, but as someone who with, obviously some knowledge about East Asian family culture, I wanted to actually take a note on this. So one thing big that is happening in the United States is that as time goes on, as diversity increases, not only, like through like different racial groups, but even like within different ethnic groups, I guess that's a really hard distinction to make. So I don't mean like black and white only. I mean like, like Anglo and Germanic, or, Romani, whatever. Any of these different combinations where the family line gets diluted and diluted more, people lose their connections with their homeland back in Europe or back in, China or Malaysia or South America or Africa, wherever it may be. People lose their family roots because it's increasingly harder to track these different family ties the longer you go away from a pure historical source, right? For example, if you had someone with like Venezuelan heritage on your great great grand one sorry singular great grandmother's side, and you have a lot of history from that side, but then you slowly dilute it throughout 3 generations with, you may add some like Colombian there or some like German, right? You're going to end up with someone who is not really aware of their family history and therefore is not dealing with a long-term family idea, right? Because not only is your last name going to change many times, you're not going to really know where you came from, nor are as many people going to actually be able to be in touch with their heritage. And the people who are extremely lucky because you're going to have that sort of experience, which a lot of Americans do not know. Now, for example, at least from the area I'm from, this is a personal anecdote, and this is one thing I'm not willing to actually generalize, but it's an observation I've made, is that anyone who tends to be of, let's say, African American or Caucasian descent, when you ask them where their family is from, a lot of times you get like, oh, I'm a mix, right? I'm a mix is a very popular thing for both of these ethnic groups, especially because it's really hard to keep track of, like, okay, especially because of the world wars as well. Wait, a French grandmother and a German grandfather. You could probably guess, how that happened, anyways. And then you have some Finnish up there and Irish, and your uncle was blah blah blah. You're gonna end up with a lot of people who are not really sure about their family heritage, and therefore that is a community and personal attachment they are missing out on, which I assume people would have had for thousands and thousands of years beforehand, as people were more or less aware of their family, and people did not move a lot back in the day because, again, not only technology and cost, but you were bound to the land you were from, especially if you're from any serfdom societies. That being said, you have the, again, people in America, but also East Asia, where family, and not only East Asia, of course, but any more, communal, what's the word, collectivist societies where family is one of the main virtues. When this happens, there's a thing called, I don't know, but like family registries, for example, are a good way of keeping track of your ancestries. My family, for example, I know has about 30 generations of continued ancestry, dating back to about the year like 1,000 or something like that, right? That I believe is impressive, and I feel a certain drawing, or I feel a certain connection to my heritage, which goes beyond just my mom, dad, sister, whatever, brother, whoever I have, right? It goes beyond that significantly, and it has to do with the idea of big family. And this is the idea I'm going to get into now. And this is a study I want to possibly conduct once I am in college and such, but I want to survey Americans and then people across the world about when they say family, ask who is in their family. And my main hypothesis with this is that you're going to get in the West, especially in America, an idea of small family, which is the people around you and the people who actually make up the literal family unit. This is going to be your parents, your grandparents if you live with them, if they're close. You know, if you have perhaps a big family, these are cousins, uncles, aunts, right? People who you regularly interact with, which are the people who actually make up the family unit itself or the family circle. And I think this is the idea of small family because it's a little bit more mature. Not really mature. I'm not even looking over anything, by the way. It's just I just have this monitor open, but it's this idea of an immaterial, sorry, a very material family, which is more defined by what people can do for you and what you can do for them, and the relationship and bond individually you feel with those people. So that's small family, and I feel like the and that is more individualistically based because it is a lot about how is this person connected to me, not how am I connected to the larger system. Whereas I feel that with big family, the idea is that you are connected to a lineage, right? Your identity is not tied to necessarily. Of course, this is very important still. That you're still connected and tied to your relationship with your father, mother, sister, brother, aunt, uncle, right? But however, this idea of, let's say you're the Smith, right? You're a Smith and you have 28 generations of blacksmithing throughout your family, and you actually know who what that is, where you came from, what your history is. That is big family. You can still be Western by doing so, and that is your family. You are the Smiths, right? You are a member of a longer, I guess, chain of happenings, um, which has led to you, but also I don't really know how to enunciate this, but the idea of big family is essentially that you are a part of a greater system, being the family itself. And the family is not only limited to the people, it is. Oh my god, epistemologically, it's a bit more. It's a wholly different like mindset, but it's a temporal family. It's a not intangible idea of family, which isn't just defined by the people inside of it. And where this becomes important, I think, is when it comes to, again, like I said earlier, Christian fundamentalist family dynamics, is as America becomes more and more, harder to trace your roots, and obviously people don't want to do like ancestry tests because it's just selling your DNA information to big AI companies and such at this point. Point is, even if you have like the 23andMe and test, it's going to be very difficult for you to track your ancestry the farther and further away you get from an actually pure source where you have information and knowledge about where your family is from. And it takes real effort, which a lot of people are not willing to do, to actually go back and trace those roots. And, very much respects my heart go out to whoever actually, manages to get that done and track down these people and their history and make like family trees and such, right? And I think dealing with that is going to be increasingly difficult, especially for the Christian fundamentalist movement, because you want to be able to try to get people into a, dedicated to the family. That is, I think, the main point of the Christian fundamentalist movement, which is just to abandon this, God of the self, so to say, as, just the self has triumphed in the last 50 to 70 years, and embrace a dedication to a greater idea, which is going to be contributing to family, the state, and ultimately the church or God. And the first step in that of obviously is going to be the family aspect, and the best way to I guess describe this is by saying like by decreasing self-expression values, you're going to be able to not only control people better, of course, but you're going to be able to make sure people are going to be doing the right things more often, and they're going to be able to actually sacrifice to contribute to each other's and to a community, thereby creating a brotherly feeling, let's say. And I think that's one of the bigger lines as well, because, one of the earlier hypothesis I had a few months ago regarding the birth rate crisis is going to be, yeah, like there is definitely some consideration we have to make when it comes to how much people weigh individual choice. Of course, at this point in time, it's not necessary to have like 9 kids to even like have 3 survive, which is the main reason that, of course, birth rates have gone down. But the point is like that going down should not equal people being unwilling to actually sacrifice some of their own things to, perhaps even if we be living with their parents to have a kid, right? There's this idea of contributing to a family line is increasingly, going down. And believe me, like when talking to people who actually have this pressure on them, the idea that you cannot be the last in your family line, that you need to go keep it going for your family's sake, and this greater idea of family, that is a real sentiment that is expressed that I don't think is really discussed. It's not really about people are selfish. It's not really that people are going to do X, Y, and Z. It's that if there's a certain pressure and that your idea and your part of your life goal should be to continue this greater idea of a big family line, that is an unquantifiable, I believe it's unquantifiable. That's an unquantifiable reason why someone might choose to do X, Y, and Z. And I think that isn't really quite discussed enough because it's really, the whole empiricist fallacy where if it's hard to measure, it's, really hard to study at the same time. But I don't think that means it doesn't warrant being, discussed at the very least at a very high level, definitely higher than me, right? To maybe come to a conclusion on whether or not this sort of thing has had an effect. The idea of having to have children for the family's sake, not even like because our parents want to be grandparents, but like for like the lineage and the sanctity of that, I believe it's a uniquely Eastern idea in today's world at this point. And in the Western world, it really doesn't have a place, and I don't believe it should have a place at the place we are now. However, if we are to go forward, if we are to try to fix our birth rate issue, some sort of rekindling of our ancestry should be, ideal. However, I do not think this is possible because it is increasingly, again, harder to track most people's ancestries as people intermix with different races and different ethnic groups, different national groups, different family groups, even with just different history within one race or one ethnicity. For example, it might be okay if I were to have a child with someone who is not of my lineage, but again, as that continues, the memory and the care and the traceability with the increasing amount of lineages, it just becomes more difficult every time you go past that certain stage. And then and that is, I believe, one of the main malaises of American community and the family structure, because again, the more separated people become from a idea of big family, the more reliant they are on small family, and therefore they don't have this sort of pressure to add to something greater, which then, simply to maintain relationships and have the, quid pro quo kind of idea when it comes to familial and relationship exchanges. And I had, I think, one more idea I want to really discuss before I want to get out of here. And the idea is of cognitive illiteracy and introspection. So one of the classes I have right now, which I thought, perfectly answered one of my questions, was that the realization that the less people read and the less people actually engage with, I guess, meta thinking and the ability to think about thinking, you get less introspective, and it's much easier, it's much more difficult basically to do that than to watch a TV show and be told what to think and be only shown the outside ideas of a character. One of the more valuable things about reading and introspection, which I think I was blessed to have at least growing up, and I hope to continue to have, is the ability to be able to uniquely assess oneself using an internal voice about where you are and why you are doing that which has got you to where you are. That's the way weird way to turn around saying it. And this idea has severe implications. So in the last video, we talked about reasonability versus rationality, and if you're truly believing that you're rational at all times, you can only be wrong, because again, human beings are not rationally motivated, they're emotionally motivated, and they rationalize what they do after into, certain boxes. And that's the introspective part. However, if you are unable to do that, you are simply going to delude yourself into thinking you are rational without the actual ability to realize if you are wrong and why you are wrong, because of course it's sometimes perfectly fine to be extremely stalwart in your beliefs. And what this cognitive illiteracy has, resulted in is, I believe, one of the main problems we have with people being unable to learn, but also people being unable to actually be able to synthesize information and trying to actually come to conclusions. I definitely have more to say. I had something about like about like ego and stuff, like ego as in like the personality, but I think that idea needs more fleshing out. And I guess another thing I could really talk about is like the billionaire bias and the idea of arbitrariness. So a lot of times you hear from especially more socialist folks or anyone really leaning left of center is that, yeah, left of center is fine. That is that, the concept of billionaires is kind of evil, and that there's, especially in the wake of the Epstein files, and that these people should be held accountable for their money, and that they don't really need this money, and therefore that they should be, taxed, and that every dollar or cents past billion should go back to the state, so where it can be wasted again by government bureaucrats. Just kidding, I didn't say that part. But that is like the intention. If you increase tax revenue, then actually like kind of cutting down, government spending, deficit doesn't change. That is a fact. Regardless, the point I'm trying to get to is that it's very interesting how this is not a policy argument, because I think Bernie Sanders suggested something similar, but I think on a lower scale, like multimillionaire or something like that. But I think it's really interesting seeing these multimillionaires or millionaires criticizing billionaires as if they are not, any worse. And that is the whole point I'm trying to get to, as if they are not any worse. And I'm yet to test this out in a conversation, but I have theory crafted this a decent amount about this idea. Is like, let's say we bring this up, billionaires shouldn't exist. So what matters more in this case? The actual semantic game of the word billionaire, or the actual wealth amount of the billionaire and the capital they carry? Because the idea is like the billionaire is a very easy target for mass media to consume, right? It's like, okay, billion is, different letter from million, and million is, more perhaps reachable. A lot of people like know millionaires, right? Or are within reach of one, right? Whether it be like just a big house in their community, or like a mayor, or a governor, congressman, whatever it may be, right? And that is a very easy target because it's more human, and billionaire is like, okay, you can imagine this person on top of a hill plotting something evil and exploiting their workers, right? Which may or may not be the case, of course, given what we've seen in the last few weeks. But then we think about this, and then we realize that this is really arbitrary and really has no value, right? Because, for example, what if you didn't work in base 10? We worked in, like, base, like, 60 or something, and we end up with, like, some big number, which is else. The net amount of value they actually have with their wealth is going to be, different. If the idea is 1 billion of something, right? Let's say we had, like, 1 billion of $2, right? Like, if 2 billion was our base unit, right? Or $2 was our base unit. Really nonsensical mathematical scenario, but again, let's just assume that billionaire didn't mean billionaire, and billionaire meant like trillionaire, right? The point is that there is no actual reasonable way to actually qualify billionaire as the standard for, wealth at which all wealth should stop. I think that idea itself is something else to be discussed, but the whole idea of trying to have a policy prescription to make it more relatable to the people at 1 billion is the most stupid thing I've heard of. Okay, 1 billion. But why not, but what if someone just stays at like $999,999,999.99, and then like, tries to like give all that money away at that point, and then they have like their own choice. But okay, or what if they just like remain stagnant at that point, right? What happens then? What about like, okay, let's say that counts, you round up. What about 800 billion or 800 million? What about 600 million? What about 500? The more you go down, it's like there's no point where it stops. Even let's say we get down to like 100 million. Okay, stop. But is 100 million that much different from 99 million and 999,000? It really isn't. And this is the arbitrariness issue, this kind of socialist policy, especially when it comes to taxing brackets, counts. Statistically, if you want to use percentiles, that's one thing. But at that point, you have like 12 billionaires, and you can't really use statistics to do so because they are such unusual outliers. There's no non-arbitrary way to actually qualify whether or not someone has too much money for it to be considered morally justifiable, without actually trying to make it, trying to actually admit that it's not a quantifiable issue, and it's really a qualitative issue. We're trying to argue for the moralistics of whether or not wealth is even valuable, whether or not people should even have wealth, and that the state should have it, or people should have it, right, is the idea. And the problem with this is that it's a really compelling argument. It's really easy to see. It's really easy to digest and be like, okay, I hate billionaires. They're definitely, corrupt, and many of them may be, right? But again, you cannot make this argument because it fails fundamentally on so many different levels, because you're not going to really understand that. Again, just because you have 1 billion, even if that was liquid, right? Even if that was liquid, does not mean you are at a certain point of morality above someone else. There's no objective way to define that. And of course, let us imagine that we are in this, completely secular, world. Upper limits to things are very difficult, not only because of inflation, but also because of, again, how are you going to justify when to stop it? Upper limits of wealth are really impossible to actually fix. However, on the other side, you have the ideology of, at least quantitatively, you have the idea of, just a purely capital market, or a capitalist market. In which point, whoever plays the market the best is going to win, and there is no upper limit, except for the fact that you can actually keep doing what you're doing. And at a certain extent, I'm sure your exploitation comes back bite you in the ass or something, and you have to know that. But again, we have never really come to that point. And to that, and because of that, it's really difficult to say, like, at what point in a policy perspective should wealth stop? And this is a severe weakness I really want to exploit in some of these arguments, because again, the whole idea of billionaires should not exist is completely arbitrary. What about, 999 millionaires, 900 billionaires. What about 800 millionaires? 800 million air. I don't mean like individual million. Okay. Anyways, and then like the more you go, they just keep going down. Like there's no point where you can legitimately stop because again, if you want to talk about like it's like that much significantly lower, you're gonna find that it's not just because 200 million is 80% lower than 1 billion. Like okay, like 80% is like the place you stop. It's still an absurd amount of wealth, and you will still be told again by the people who are willing to actually try to increase taxes on the people that that's still too much. And I think that is the weakness not only of the I hate to drag on the economic left side because they have at least some respectability. But it's not only a fault and problem that the economic left side has to address when it comes to at least taxation-based economic left policies. I don't mean like collectivist ones, which are stupid in their own way, which I might not. The same problem is shared when it comes to the atheists and the people who want to secularize society and the people who very silly believe in objective morality, which can work, but I'll explain how. The idea we've discussed multiple times is that morality cannot be objective and it cannot be subjective at the same time, right? Those two things cannot coincide. And here's the two concepts. If morality is subjective, sorry, if morality is objective, then you should be able to empirically define what is moral and what is not. And a lot of people like to argue like, I don't need religion for morality, or I don't need a belief structure would be a better word for morality because I don't want to do things, not understanding that they themselves are socialized under some sort of religious or belief system otherwise, right? On the other hand, you have people saying that morality, the religious books and the other, structures of belief, they're right. They're wrong because, morality is subjective. Everything and anything could be whatever and whatever I want them to be. This, of course, is equally wrong for quite obvious reasons, in that it doesn't really help the atheist movement at all. Because if morality is subjective, you're not going to be able to actually unify the entire movement of people of different, backgrounds, of different values and different priorities naturally to actually agree on a certain set of principles. Because if morality is subjective, which subjective reality are going to make laws on? Which subjective morality are you going to actually create structure in society on? This whole paradox of these two different, impossibilities is what drives me to actually conclude that the most logical way to organize society is around a single set of beliefs. A single set of beliefs which is able to encompass almost all things in life. That is the thing. The value of making like a Bible-based Christian society isn't because it's right in all matters. It definitely probably isn't. It matters because you can take the Bible, and the only argument you need to make for any sort of moral policy is the Bible itself, not the individual scriptures inside. Because once you take the Bible as objective, then you can equally apply that standard to all parts of morals of society. And the only thing you have to actually worry about is convincing people that the Bible is legitimate. And that was able to be done in the past without that secular society, which I think is the reason why it's increasingly getting hard to actually convince people as a whole that objective morality exists. And that's because it doesn't. But different societies have different foundational beliefs which inform every part of society. And that is what is valuable. Because you're not picking and choosing like, okay, for this we are like more liberal, and for this we are more conservative. For this we are completely libertarian, right? And having that one single base, so that you only have to like, instead of having to branch out and like justify every single moral attribute with some sort of empirical method, you can ignore empiricism, take one method that works really well across all things and apply that evenly, such that the only authority you need to challenge is the book itself. And the connection of this, I was going on a tangent, I guess, to the earlier point about whether or not, so I guess the earlier point about the connection between atheism and the arbitrary left economic group, is that the idea of tackling something which has already always had a history of being existing in one terms, which is going to be excessive wealth, and the other being the idea of an objective morality derived through a holy text. The idea of setting upper limits and lower limits, I guess, in terms of morality, is extremely difficult because it's very hard to actually get a body of people which can agree what those limits are. And that is the main problem with this whole idea of the billionaire thing, right? How are you going to decide how much money is too much, and then how much money should you take after that point, and from who and from when, and who's going to be involved in making that, and whether or not that's even enforceable. And the problem with the atheist coalition is that how are you going to decide with all these different people who want to have their own share of and change, who have all these different people have their own view of morality, which is either derived or not derived from religious views. How are you going to convince each of them that your version is right and that this morality is empirically correct? Because morality is something that we feel really deep inside and we're very passionate about. They don't change, right? You will not be able to convince me in 100 years that rape is okay. And that fact alone makes it impossible to actually manage together a coalition of people or even thinkers who are going to be actually able to impart values, impart morality as a whole in the populace. And I think that's a really big weakness in that system right now, which is reflected again in this whole idea, I guess this billionaire idea, like a springboard into that next idea, where if you don't have a singular founding, it's going to be extremely very difficult to spread out a consistent standard only using objectivity and empiricism, right? And if you're not doing that, then you're admitting that people are influenced by status quo, belief structures, which is going to be ultimately Judeo-Christian values in America and wherever else you might find X, Y, and Z beliefs. Because the second that the atheist movement concedes that people's beliefs and current wants are not just natural and are actually socialized through this sort of worldview over, decades and centuries, that's the moment you concede that everything we believe right now that you believe is good. Like, okay, I don't want to do this because that's just what I feel that way, and that's a good thing, right? That's a good thing. I don't want to kill people. Okay, and then you really go back, you look at it all, and you found it doesn't have to be kill, of course, right? But then you realize that this whole idea of the sanctity of human life is conditioned within us and really socialized. Then you have no argument. Then you're basically conceding that everything we believe in is good is only good because we believe that it's good because of some belief structure that's already existing. And this is not really possible to fix or know empirically because human societies by nature cannot exist unobserved. They cannot exist without any socialization because then that would require us study a society of humans and their behaviors without giving them like that would be like if we spawned 100 humans in the middle of the forest and just watch them for 100 years, right? That's just not gonna work because obviously that's just it's just not gonna work, right? They're not going to even be able to get close to our modern standards of technology, which have socialized us to this point. Anyways, the point is, right, you have all these layers of ideas when it comes to arbitrariness, which kind of infects our whole political stance because people are trying to make quantifiable policy related appeals to rhetoric, even though they are really making emotional appeals. However, because emotional appeals seem a little bit weaker, and in reality, they don't really have any policy substance, it's really hard to do. So a lot of what ends up happening, I believe, is there's a lot of middle grounding where you kind of just flirt around the issue without actually getting to what matters. And why people do this is beyond me when it comes to intellectual dishonesty with themselves, but it's a conversation I want to have, especially with someone on the economic left, which I would love to have if someone wants to, I don't know, comments that they would love to talk on a call or something. Anyways, these are my thoughts for February, I guess. Maybe there's a video coming out at the end of the month, but that's been it, and bye bye.